You are standing in London sometime around the year 1720. The air tastes faintly of smoke, river damp, and something else, a sharp sweetness that seems to linger in every alleyway. It is the scent of juniper. The city is drunk, and you are walking through the beginnings of one of history's most peculiar moral panics, the gin craze. London at this time is a city in transition. The fires of the 1660s have long gone cold, but their consequences still shape the skyline. Narrow timbered streets have been replaced by bricks and soot, and the rebuilding has invited a swelling tide of migrants from the countryside. Fields have become neighbourhoods. The poor, freshly unrooted from rural England, find themselves squeezed into rented rooms where 8 or 10 souls might share a single bedstead. In these places, gin becomes not a luxury but a comfort, cheap, fiery, and dependable. The story of gin begins not in the taverns but in the policies of the British state. In the early 1700s, the government faced a difficult problem: how to fund its endless wars with France without raising taxes on the landed gentry. The answer was as intoxicating as it was disastrous. Importing French brandy became politically unfashionable during wartime, so Parliament encouraged the production of homegrown spirits, distilled from surplus grain and flavoured with the exotic berries of the juniper tree. Gin was English, gin was patriotic, and gin was, crucially, untaxed. The effects were immediate. By 1720, there were thousands of unlicensed stills operating across London. Housewives distilled in their kitchens. Bakers fermented mash in back rooms. Soldiers, discharged from service, found work selling gin by the dram from tiny wooden booths. The government's permissive attitude created a market that expanded faster than any could have predicted. Between 1720 and 1750, the average Londoner drank more than 2 pence of gin per week, a staggering figure for a population already soaked in ale and beer. Yet to understand the gin craze, you must imagine the economy that surrounded it. Wages were low, bread was expensive, coal, needed to heat the city's growing number of hearths, rose in cost every winter. The influx of the rural poor created competition for work, forcing many into unsteady labour, dock work, street sweeping, rag picking, or prostitution. In such an existence, gin offered a kind of steadying illusion. It dulled hunger, quieted the cold, and made the filth of daily life blur at the edges. It was also, quite simply, accessible. Beer required brewing equipment, wine demanded imports, but gin could be made in a washtub. The recipe was not mysterious: mash grain, distill it, and flavour the harsh result with juniper berries, coriander, and citrus peel. What emerged was raw, potent, and often dangerous, a concoction so strong that it sometimes stripped paint from the walls of the barrels that held it. The spirit's ubiquity soon birthed a new urban economy. Gin lanes appeared, lined with small shops whose wooden signs, "Drunk for a penny, dead drunk for 2, mocked the suffering they caused. Women, who had been largely excluded from tavern culture, now became primary customers and sellers. For the first time, intoxication became both public and domestic, private and civic. Mothers gave gin to infants to quiet them, employers paid servants with it. The historian Thomas Wilson wrote that gin is the mother's milk and the father's ruin. In a paradoxical twist, gin was also seen as medicinal. Apothecaries sold cordials, containing the same ingredients, tonics for melancholy, tonics for nerves. The line between remedy and vice blurred. A woman drinking gin from a blue bottle in the afternoon could easily justify it as a treatment for grief or weariness. It was, after all, cheaper than tea. Yet as the 1720s wore on, the mood shifted. Newspapers began to carry stories of gin, madness, of infants smothered by drunken mothers, of soldiers collapsing in the streets, of families selling their furniture for another flask. The cartoonist William Hogarth would later immortalize this fear in his famous engraving Gin Lane. But the moral panic had already begun decades earlier. Preachers thundered against the corruption of the city, equating gin with sin itself. The same parliament that had once encouraged distillation began to whisper about control. The so-called Gin Acts began to appear, though in their early form they were poorly enforced. The first, passed in 1729, introduced a small duty on gin sellers and required a license. But the licenses were too expensive, the inspectors too few, and the public appetite too great. Within months, illicit gin shops flourished again. For every legitimate distiller shuttered by the Act, a dozen backyard stills took its place. The government's attempt at moral regulation had only driven the trade underground. By 1730, London was a city divided by intoxication. The wealthy mocked the poor for their weakness, while quietly sipping imported wines. Magistrates complained that gin made the lower classes insolent and idle, yet it was their own policies that had flooded the streets with cheap spirits. The contradictions ran deep. Gin was both a symptom and a symbol of the age's instability. Walk through Covent Garden at dusk, and you would have seen the glow of tallow lamps reflected in puddles of spilled liquor, the cries of hawkers selling gin by the spoonful mixed with the sound of carriage wheels and church bells. Even the language of the time absorbed intoxication. Madame Geneva, as gin was affectionately called, became both muse and monster. To drink was to escape, to abstain was to suffer. The moralists, of course, sought explanations. They saw in gin the decay of Protestant virtue, the rise of idleness, the fall of family. But for the drinkers themselves, the reasons were simpler. Life was hard, and gin was easy. The city's infrastructure, its overcrowded housing, its fragile labour markets, all conspired to make intoxication the only reliable relief. The historian Patrick Dillon called it a citywide act of quiet rebellion against discomfort. By the end of the 1730s, London's streets had become laboratories of human endurance. Infant mortality soared, crime increased, the parish workhouses overflowed. The smell of juniper mingled with sewage, coal dust, and the sour yeast of cheap bread. Yet even in this squalor, life persisted, markets bustled, bells tolled, and the gin shops never closed. To modern eyes, it seems like collective madness. But perhaps the question is not why London drank so much gin, but what it was trying to forget. Beneath the drunken laughter and moral sermons lay a deeper unease. The unease of a city growing too quickly, governed too poorly, and consumed by the contradictions of its own ambition. As you listen to the echoes of those streets, where the rattle of cups and the hum of inebriated conversation blend into the night air, you might ask yourself, by the early 1740s, London had learned to live with its hangover. The scent of juniper had become as ordinary as the sound of iron-shod horses or the tolling of St. Paul's bells. To be drunk was no longer shocking. It was a background condition of the city. Like the fog, like the soot, like the river itself. You move through Holborn at dawn. Milk sellers call out, their voices hoarse. In the gutter lies a tipped bottle with the familiar blue tint of Madame Geneva. A constable passes it without notice. For all the sermons and pamphlets, the city has accepted that drunkenness is part of its rhythm. The economy of gin has become an industry. Officially, Parliament still collects duties on its sale, but the real profits flow through an invisible network of middlemen. Distillers, smugglers, and small-scale hawkers who carry flasks beneath their aprons. The production figures, though uncertain, are astounding. In 1743, London alone consumed an estimated 10 million gallons of gin. That is not a statistic so much as a landscape warehouses filled with barrels, canals lined with crates, and thousands of households earning their survival from the trade. Every step of the process is small, domestic, and repetitive. Barley and oats arrive from the countryside, loaded off barges by boys whose hands are always sticky with malt. The grain is ground, fermented in wooden tubs, and then distilled through copper stills that hiss and sweat like living creatures. The air in these workshops is heavy with the scent of yeast and burnt sugar. Many are run by women, widows or wives supplementing their husbands' wages. They know the rhythm of the stills better than they know the church calendar. It is here that the city's ingenuity shines through its vice. Recipes are guarded secrets. Some add a pinch of angelica root, others a shaving of citrus rind or a handful of peppercorns. A bad batch can turn deadly, filled with sulfuric impurities or adulterated with turpentine to mimic the bitterness of juniper. Yet people keep buying. The danger is simply another cost of living. Gin lanes and moral alarm by midday. The narrow lanes near Moorfields and Steegiles teem with drinkers. They are labourers, laundresses, servants between jobs, sailors waiting for ships that may never sail. There are women with infants tied to their backs, sipping gin from pewter mugs, old men with one shoe and half a coat, mumbling hymns between gulps. The gin shops, often no larger than a modern pantry, advertise with wooden boards painted crudely, a smiling woman, a crown, a skull. Inside, the air is thick with humanity. No music, no laughter, only the slow murmur of exhaustion. The drink dulls pain, but also time itself. Hours pass unnoticed. A woman might enter at noon and leave at dusk without remembering either. It is this image that terrifies the reformers. Newspapers publish lurid illustrations of gin mothers, their children neglected or worse. Pamphlets with titles such as The Downfall of Madame Geneva or A Brief Discourse on the Pernicious Spirit circulate through coffeehouses. Clergymen thunder from pulpits, warning that gin will destroy not just bodies but the English soul. The city's rulers cannot decide whether gin is a symptom or a cause. On one hand, it keeps the poor docile, a cheap pacifier in a time of inflation and unrest. On the other, it breeds disorder, fills prisons, and drains the workhouses. The contradictions are as dizzying as the drink itself. The Gin Act of 1736. In September 1736, after years of debate, Parliament attempts a cure. The new Gin Act imposes a license fee of $50 on retailers and a heavy excise duty per gallon. The logic is simple: make gin expensive, and people will stop drinking it. But the lawmakers underestimate the determination of the thirsty. Within weeks, riots break out. Crowds gather outside magistrates' houses shouting, "No gin, no king." Effigies of officials are burned in the streets. Licensed sellers are harassed and unlicensed ones multiply. The law, unenforceable, collapses under its own absurdity. By year's end, not a single license has been legally purchased in London. Instead, the underground trade blossoms. Sellers adopt false names. Captain Gin, the Mad Queen, the Happy Man. They operate in alleys, cellars, even churchyards. A customer whispers a code word. A bottle appears through a hatch. Money changes hands and the night continues. Enforcement becomes a game of cat and mouse, with informers earning small rewards for each conviction. Yet juries, drawn from gin-drinking citizens, often refuse to convict their neighbours. For reformers, the failure is humiliating. For drinkers, it is liberation. The Gin Act of 1736, intended to sober the nation, becomes a dark joke. The peak of consumption by 1740, gin's popularity reaches its zenith. The population of London approaches 700,000, and gin has seeped into every layer of life. Servants begin their mornings with it. Apprentices end their shifts with it. And even children sip it from watered mugs. Soldiers are issued rations to keep morale high. Contemporary observers note curious social effects. In the slums, the birth rate remains high but infant survival plummets. The coroner's reports tell a grim story: babies overlaid, smothered in bed by mothers too drunk to wake. In some parishes, gin becomes a form of currency. Landlords accept it in lieu of rent. Pawnbrokers trade it for clothes. The artist William Hogarth, ever the moral observer, begins sketching scenes for what will become his paired engravings Gin Lane and Beer Street. In Gin Lane, chaos reigns. A mother drops her child. A man hangs himself. A pawnshop thrives. Beer Street, by contrast, depicts healthy craftsmen and cheerful order. The message is blunt: beer builds, gin destroys. The images circulate widely, turning moral judgment into mass entertainment. The physicians and the poor amid the panic. London's physicians and apothecaries debate whether gin can ever be reformed. Some propose diluting it, others suggest selling it only under prescription. Hospitals begin to note patterns of gin palsy, a wasting disease of the limbs, and of dropsy, the swelling of the body from chronic drinking. Parish doctors record these details in neat cursive ledgers that will later serve historians as the anatomy of addiction. Still, one must remember that gin was not simply poison, it was also livelihood. Distillers employed thousands, from coopers who built barrels to draymen who hauled them. Every attempt to suppress the trade threatened economic collapse in neighbourhoods that had little else. Reformers could preach abstinence, but they offered no bread. The Gin Act of 1743, and after recognising the failure of the earlier law, Parliament tries again in 1743 with a milder act lowering duties and reducing the licence fee. The state hopes to draw sellers back into legality. The result is paradoxical: by making gin somewhat respectable, consumption rises again. Meanwhile, grain harvests falter. Bad weather in 1740 leads to higher prices for bread. Starvation looms in the countryside, and cheap gin becomes once more the poor man's solace. Reformers write pamphlets comparing the English labourer to the Roman slave, both pacified by rations, both doomed to servitude. Yet for the ordinary Londoner, survival matters more than metaphor. The moral reform movement. By the mid-1740s, a new coalition forms: magistrates, bishops, and social reformers who call themselves the Society for the Reformation of Manners. Their meetings are stiff affairs, full of resolutions written in looping script. They urge parish constables to arrest gin sellers, encourage employers to pay wages in coin rather than liquor, and sponsor sermons extolling sobriety. They also understand the power of publicity. Handbills printed in cheap ink describe the gin devil, devouring English virtue. Some feature rhymed couplets easy to recite in the street. Who drinks Geneva drinks his grave, who sips her twice becomes her slave. Children memorize the verses without knowing what they mean. Yet despite their efforts, the city continues to drink. The reformers' problem is not moral but structural. Gin fills the vacuum left by poverty, by loneliness, by the absence of any gentler relief. Until those conditions change, no sermon can compete with the promise of a warm, burning swallow. The Gin Act of 1751, finally, after years of failed legislation, the government introduces the Gin Act of 1751, the measure that will slowly bring the craze to an end. It is less punitive, more practical. It targets not the drinkers but the distributors, making licenses cheaper but restricting them to reputable sellers. Small tippling houses are gradually squeezed out, and the large distilleries come under tighter control. The act coincides with other changes. Grain prices rise, wages stabilize, and tea, once a luxury, becomes affordable. A new habit begins to replace the old. The kettle, not the still, becomes the symbol of domestic comfort. But in the early 1750s, that transformation is not yet complete. For now, gin remains the city's shadow companion. At night, the smell still drifts from tenement windows, mingling with the smoke of hearth fires and the damp of the Thames. The echo of Madame Geneva. If you listen carefully, you can hear the echo of her laughter in the city's hum. She is no longer triumphant, but she is not yet defeated. The moralists boast of progress, yet they still drink quietly behind closed doors. Soldiers still line up at dawn for their morning ration. Mothers still hush their babies with a spoonful of spirit. The gin craze is not only a story of intoxication, it is a mirror of contradiction between wealth and want, morality and survival, control and chaos. The same government that condemns gin profits from its taxation, the same preachers who denounce it rely on congregations too wary to stay sober. As 1751 dawns, London stands at the threshold of change. The city will soon trade its juniper scent for the steam of tea leaves, its street brawls for factory bells. But for one last decade, it lingers in the half-light of intoxication, not quite drunk, not yet sober, suspended in the slow rhythm of history. And as you picture the lanterns flickering above Gin Lane, you might wonder it is the year 1752. London is changing again, though the streets look much the same. The smell of coal smoke still clings to the river fog, the clatter of carriage wheels still echoes through Fleet Street, and the poor still outnumber the comfortable by many thousands. Yet beneath these familiar sounds, something subtle has shifted. The city is sobering. The gin craze, that quarter-century of intoxication, panic and reform, has not vanished overnight. Instead, it has ebbed quietly and almost imperceptibly, like the tide slipping away from the wharves. The small booths that once sold gin by the spoonful are closing. Some owners have turned to selling tea, others to coffee or all. A few have gone to prison. More often, they have simply drifted into other trades, their stills rusting in the corners of cellars. A city coming down. The reasons for gin's decline are complex, and no single law deserves full credit. The Gin Act of 1751 was more successful than its predecessors, but it worked precisely because the city was ready for it. Grain prices had risen steadily, making raw materials expensive. The wages of the urban poor had recovered slightly after the lean years of the 1740s, and tea, once the preserve of the wealthy, was now within reach of apprentices and housemaids. It was clean, comforting, and crucially sober. The government, too, had learned discretion. Rather than provoke riots with draconian taxes, it imposed quiet restrictions. Cellars required local endorsements. Large distillers were monitored more closely. Small, anonymous gin shops were quietly fined out of existence. The result was not prohibition, but normalization. Gin did not disappear, it simply became ordinary. This gradual moderation suited the English temperament. Where the earlier decades had swung between indulgence and hysteria, the 1750s sought balance. The moral reformers could declare victory without confronting their own hypocrisies, and the working poor could continue to drink. Just a little less, and a little more privately. The streets after gin. If you were to walk through St. Giles in 1755, you might still find a few holdouts' dim rooms where widows sold drams from cracked teapots, or cellar bars whose patrons sang songs about Madame Geneva, as if she were an old lover long gone. But the crowds were smaller, the mood quieter. The city's energy had shifted elsewhere. Coffee houses, once the haunts of scholars and pamphleteers, were multiplying. Tea merchants advertised respectable domestic refreshment. The same printing presses that once churned out moral tracts about gin now printed recipe books and news sheets. A middle class was forming, not yet powerful but restless and growing. Their morality was one of moderation and self-improvement, not drunken oblivion. Even the architecture reflected this new sobriety. The narrow medieval lanes that had sheltered the gin shops were being widened. The first Georgian terraces rose, their brick fire aids uniform and tidy. Streets were straightened, drains improved, lamps replaced. Order was seeping into the city, brick by brick. The fate of the distillers, the gin distillers, once symbols of urban chaos, adapted with surprising speed. The larger companies, such as Booths and Gordons, secured proper licenses and expanded production for legitimate trade. Their gin was cleaner, smoother, and advertised as respectable. the drink of the gentleman's drawing room rather than the pauper's hovel. It was the beginning of branding, long before the term existed. Labels bore royal warrants, ornate crests, and promises of purity. What had once been a symbol of degradation was being polished into an emblem of refinement. This transformation, from vice to virtue, was not unique to gin, but gin embodied it best. The small-time distillers, however, were less fortunate. Deprived of cheap grain and hounded by parish constables, many slipped into poverty. Some emigrated, carrying their craft with them. In the American colonies, particularly in New England, the art of distillation found new life, producing rum, whiskey, and brandy. The legacy of London's intoxication travelled across the ocean, leaving behind both its methods and its myth. The human coast, for those who lived through the height of the craze, the scars were literal and visible. Contemporary reports tell of widespread disease among habitual drinkers. Swollen limbs, trembling hands, ruined teeth. Parish records describe orphans found in the street, the mother being dead of drink. Yet as the decades passed, memory softened. The children of those years grew up to tell stories of the old days, when gin was cheap and plentiful, as though remembering a fevered dream. Social reformers used these memories as cautionary tales. In sermons and pamphlets, the gin craze became a parable of national decline narrowly averted. The moral was simple. Discipline must replace indulgence, order must overcome chaos. The same rhetoric that had once condemned gin now underpinned the emerging ideology of industriousness. The belief that the strength of a nation rested on the sobriety of its citizens. This moral narrative served political ends as well. The English ruling class, anxious about the growing urban poor, found comfort in the idea that poverty could be cured by self-control. The deeper causes, inequality, enclosure, the instability of wages, were conveniently forgotten. Gin became both scapegoat and symbol, a way to talk about social order without addressing its foundations. From Gin Lane to the Empire, as the 18th century progressed, Britain turned outward again. Its empire expanded across oceans, its merchants sailed farther than ever before, and its wealth began to concentrate in new hands. London was no longer merely the capital of England. It was becoming the capital of commerce. The same energy that had once fueled the stills now powered factories, docks, and counting houses. Discipline, learned painfully in the aftermath of the gin craze, became a civic virtue. The sober worker, punctual and obedient, replaced the gin-soaked labour of the 1730s. There was, however, a quiet irony in this transformation. The wealth of the empire was still lubricated by intoxicants. Tea from China, sugar from the Caribbean, rum from the colonies. The moralists who celebrated sobriety at home built their fortunes on global addiction. Gin had merely shifted shape, becoming part of a wider economy of consumption. The reformers' legacy by the end of the century, the gin craze was remembered with a mixture of embarrassment and fascination. It became a subject for historians, caricaturists, and moral philosophers. William Hogarth's Gin Lane hung in drawing rooms as a reminder of how far the nation had come, or how easily it could fall again. In 1790, a clergyman named Reverend Thomas Warner delivered a sermon titled The Spirit of Temperance. In it, he described the gin craze as the darkest proof of human folly and divine mercy. His words, delivered nearly 40 years after the last major riots, drew nods from a congregation that had never known those years firsthand. History was already turning into myth, and yet, for all the moral posturing, gin never truly left. It endured quietly, in gentler form, passing from the hands of the poor to the cabinets of the polite. By the time Queen Victoria took the throne in 1837, gin had become almost respectable again, its rough edges smoothed, its history largely forgotten. Everyday life after the craze, in the ordinary rhythms of Georgian life. The end of the gin craze brought new patterns. Taverns became more orderly, their patrons older and more restrained. Domestic tea tables replaced gin shops as social centres. The brewing industry revived, producing milder ales designed for daily consumption. The culture of respectability that would define the Victorian age began here, in the ruins of the gin craze. Cleanliness, sobriety, thrift, and domestic virtue were all reactions to the chaos of those earlier decades. A society that had once prided itself on freedom now prized control. And yet, beneath this veneer of respectability, the same hungers persisted. People still sought escape, still craved warmth in the cold city nights. They simply found it in subtler ways, in coffee, in conversation, in routine. The emotional function of gin did not vanish, it only changed its form. The ghost of Madame Geneva, even as late as the 1820s, ballads about Madame Geneva, were sung in London taverns. She was no longer a figure of fear, but of nostalgia, a ghost of the past. Some verses mocked her, others mourned her. They've bound her hands with paper laws and chained her to a sign, but still she haunts the midnight streets and whispers through the wine. To hear such a song was to glimpse the strange tenderness with which people remembered their own ruin. Gin had destroyed lives, yet it had also offered comfort. It was a companion in misery, and misery has a long memory. Lessons from intoxication looking back. Historians have argued over the true meaning of the gin craze. Was it a moral crisis, an economic one, or simply a social experiment gone wrong? The answer, perhaps, lies in the convergence of all three. The craze revealed the fragility of early modern urban life, how quickly poverty and policy could shape behavior, how easily comfort could become dependence. It showed that moral panics often say more about the fearful than about the feared. And it proved that reform, when it comes, is less a triumph of virtue than an accident of circumstance. For every moralist who preached sobriety, there were hundreds of quiet citizens who simply adapted. They survived. They worked. They drank less. They moved on. History remembers the riots and the laws, but the true end of the gin craze was not written in Parliament. It was written in kitchens and workshops, in the steady hands of those who chose tea over gin because it let them wake up clear-headed the next morning. The lasting echo when we speak of Georgian London, we often imagine its elegance, powdered wigs, candlelit assemblies, polished manners. Yet beneath that facade lies the memory of juniper and smoke, of cheap liquor and desperate laughter. The gin craze was the shadow of that elegance, the price of progress paid by those who lived at the bottom. Modern London, with its pubs and gin bars, still carries faint traces of that history. Every glass poured today, measured, refined, and marketed as craft, is an echo of those crude stills in the back alleys of St. Giles. The city that once drowned itself in spirits has learned to sip them instead. The streets are quieter now, but if you close your eyes, you might still hear it, the clink of a pewter mug, the hiss of a copper still, the laughter of the desperate and the defiant. The gin craze has ended, but its spirit, restless, resilient, and entirely human, endures, and as you drift towards sleep, one final question lingers in the soft hum of history. You are in London in the spring of 1660. The air smells faintly of tar and tallow, of ink and damp parchment. The city hums like a living machine, rebuilt after decades of war and uncertainty. King Charles VI has returned to the throne after years of exile, and with him comes a sprawling tangle of bureaucracy. The offices, clerks, and ledgers required to manage an empire that is just beginning to imagine itself. Among these clerks is Samuel Pepys, a man of modest birth, sharp mind, and boundless curiosity. At 27, he works as a personal secretary to Edward Montagu, a rising naval officer. His handwriting is small, tidy, and patient, a habit that reflects the rhythm of his day's letters, accounts, inventories, orders, and receipts. Pepys's world is a world of paperwork. Ships cannot sail without orders. Sailors cannot be paid without signatures. Cannonballs, tar, hemp, and biscuit must all be recorded. Every transaction, every movement of goods is inked into the fabric of governance. It is the dull, indispensable labor that keeps the navy, and by extension the empire, afloat. And yet amid the monotony, Pepys finds wonder. His diary, begun on January 1st, 1660, is not a grand chronicle but a private experiment in self-observation. He writes in a code, a mixture of shorthand and Spanish words, to keep prying eyes away. His entries are careful and unassuming. Up betimes to the office, where all the morning busy about accounts. Dined at home, and then to the Duke's house to see a play. But between those lines history hums. The city reawakens. London in 1660 is both old and new. The scars of civil war remain, the ruined houses of royalists, the memories of Puritan austerity, but the restoration has breathed colour back into the city. The theatres reopen. Music fills the taverns. Silk and periwigs return to fashion. Yet beneath the glitter lies a machinery of administration that few notice. Ships returning from Tangier or Barbados must be inspected, their cargoes logged, their crews accounted for. The Navy office on Seething Lane, Pepys's workplace, is a hive of this quiet labour. Ledgers line the walls in neat ranks, their spines labelled with years and names. Stores, 1659-60, wages, Portsmouth, provisions, Deptford Yard. Pepys's role is to ensure that nothing escapes record. He drafts letters, checks figures, and signs receipts with an almost religious devotion to accuracy. The monotony would drive many mad, but Pepys seems to thrive on it. To him, order is beauty. A well-kept account book gives him the same satisfaction others might find in a sonnet. He writes in his diary, "Methinks it is a brave thing to see the manner of our offices, how all things are ordered. The bureaucrat's ritual, his daily routine, is nearly monastic. He wakes at dawn, washes with cold water, and dresses carefully. Plain wool by day, finer linen by night. Breakfast is bread and beer. He walks to the Navy office, where he spends long hours bent over ledgers by candlelight. He writes with a steady hand, dipping his quill every few lines into the black ink that stains his fingers. At noon, he dines with his clerks, salted beef, pickled herring, sometimes a bit of pigeon pie. Conversation is practical, the state of the docks, the price of rope, rumours of ship captains gone rogue. Then back to the desk. In the evening, he visits the theatre or his patron Montague, or occasionally the tavern. At home, he records the day in his diary before bed, not as art, but as record. The habit of record keeping is both his profession and his pleasure. Through repetition, Pepys transforms the act of writing into a kind of prayer to posterity. The machinery of empire, it is easy to forget that empires are built not only by kings and generals but by clerks. Every ship Pepys accounts for, every rope, biscuit, and barrel of pitch, represents a link in a vast unseen web stretching from London to the Caribbean, from Tangier to Bombay. The Royal Navy of the 1660s is still a fragile instrument. Ships rot in harbour for lack of funds, sailors desert when unpaid. Pepys's task is to impose order where chaos threatens. He inspects dockyards, audits supply lists, and reports on inefficiencies. His letters are full of phrases like wanting cordage, short of biscuit, the stores in very ill condition. His diligence earns him notice. By 1662, he is appointed clerk of the Acts to the Navy Board, responsible for the daily management of the entire fleet. The position brings both prestige and exhaustion. Pepys's diary grows thicker with entries about shipwrights, contracts, and the endless problem of corruption. It troubles me, he writes, to see how every man looks after his own profit. Still, he plays the game. He learns whom to flatter, when to bribe, and how to appear both honest and useful. Bureaucracy is a theatre of its own, and Pepys becomes one of its most skilled actors. London in motion while Pepys scribbles in his office. The city around him swells with life. Carts rattle over cobblestones, apprentices shout in the markets, church bells mark the hours. The Thames, always busy, carries barges laden with coal, timber, and the refuse of a city that never stops eating and building. Each evening, the streets fill with flickering lanterns. The smell of roasted meat mixes with the sour tang of the river. Prostitutes call from doorways, preachers thunder at corners, musicians play for coins. London is both grand and filthy, both civilized and wild. Pepys records it all with equal attention, from the gossip of courtiers to the price of a new wig. He delights in small details, a good dinner, a clever song, the feel of new gloves. Yet his diary also captures the unease of a city poised between medieval habit and modern bureaucracy. Old systems of patronage and corruption rub awkwardly against the new ideal of administrative efficiency. Pepys stands at that crossroads, half a man of the old world, half a prophet of the new. The paper empire. If you entered the Navy office, you might first notice the smell, a mixture of ink, wax, and old parchment. The floors creak under the weight of documents. Each department has its own desk, its own method, its own chaos. Clerks copy letters by hand using sand to dry the ink. The air hums with murmured dictation. Files are stored in wooden boxes labelled with quill, scratched tags, letters from Yarmouth, accounts of biscuit stores, warrants signed. Each piece of paper represents money, labour, and the fragile memory of empire. Lose a page and a ship might go unpaid. Misplace a letter and an entire fleet might go hungry. Pepys takes comfort in this order, and in the power it grants him. He begins to see the empire not as a distant abstraction, but as a system of documents, each one connected by ink and effort. He writes, "I do see how our whole strength lies not in arms, but in the keeping of our accounts." The private man, yet the diary also reveals the man behind the ledger. Pepys is ambitious, vain, sometimes lecherous. He frets about money, about his clothes, about his wife's temper. He worries about illness, a pain in his side, perhaps a remnant of the surgery that once saved him from a bladder stone. He also worries about the soul. "I do fear God," he writes, "but yet I find myself much given to the pleasures of the world." His religion is pragmatic, his conscience elastic. He cheats on his wife, feels guilty, swears to reform, and repeats the pattern. His honesty, at least with himself, is what makes his diary so remarkable. Through Pepys, we glimpse the ordinariness of early modern life, the fear of disease, the hunger for comfort, the daily balancing of duty and desire. He is not a hero, but a man trying to make sense of a world that is expanding faster than anyone can comprehend. The clockwork of habit. There is something hypnotic about Pepys's repetition. Each day begins and ends much the same. The entries blur together in a comforting rhythm. up betimes, to the office, dined at home, to bed. Yet within that repetition lies the structure of survival. Routine is his defense against chaos. Through habit, Pepys builds stability, both for himself and for the machinery of empire. Every signature, every copied letter, every tally mark in a ledger is an act of faith in order. He does not conquer lands or command ships, but he keeps their records, and in doing so, he anchors them to history. It is a kind of invisible power, quiet, bureaucratic, and deeply human. The great fire preluded. In the distance, the city's wooden heart beats faster. New buildings crowd closer together. Chimneys lean at odd angles. The summer of 1666 will bring a dry wind and something more. But for now, the fire is only metaphorical. Pepys continues to rise in station, earning the favour of the Duke of York and the envy of his peers. He buys fine clothes, collects books, and experiments with music. His diary swells with self-congratulation and self-doubt. He writes of great content one day and trouble of mind the next. The world is changing around him, though he does not yet see how much. The city grows, the empire stretches its fingers across oceans, the navy becomes the instrument of a global ambition. Pepys, in his small office, is part of that transformation, even if he sees only his ink-stained hands. And as you picture him sitting there, scratching away at his diary by candlelight, you might wonder you wake to the sound of bells. It is the early morning of September said 1666, and the air in London carries a strange scent, something sharp and dry, like burning tar. Samuel Pepys, roused by the distant noise, opens his window on Seething Lane. In the darkness to the west, he can see a faint red glow. It begins small, a baker's shop on Pudding Lane, but by noon the wind turns fierce, and the city, built of timber and pitch, becomes a furnace. Pepys dresses quickly, slips into the street, and walks toward the Thames. He watches as fire leaps from house to house, carried by the wind like a living thing. The bells of St. Magnus and St. Olave's ring madly, warning and pleading. Within hours, the blaze becomes unstoppable. Pepys records the moment in his diary. Jane called us up about 3 in the morning to tell us of a great fire. So I rose and slipped on my nightgown and went to her window and thought it far enough off, and so went to bed again. About 7 I rose again and found it broke out further, and a great fire it was. His calm tone belies the chaos around him. The streets fill with people carrying bundles, furniture, and children. The river teems with boats loaded with goods and livestock. The smell of smoke thickens until the sun turns red. For 4 days the fire devours London. The city in flames. Pepys, though terrified, remains methodical. He sends his servants to bury his valuables, including his wine and Parmesan cheese, in his garden. He visits Whitehall to warn the king, who listens intently as Pepys describes the devastation. The houses, he says, are all burnt down as far as the sight will reach. Charles Sue orders the blowing up of houses to create fire breaks, a desperate measure that comes too late. By the time the flames subside, 13,000 homes, 87 churches, and most of the medieval city of London are gone. And yet, amidst the ashes, Pepys takes notes. He describes the behaviour of crowds, the patterns of the wind, the mood of the king. He writes as if recording a bureaucratic disaster, an account of loss rather than emotion. His habit of documentation never wavers. Even as the city burns, he thinks like a clerk, tallying, comparing, accounting for each change. It is not detachment but discipline. The mind of a man trained to observe, to order chaos through words. The ledger survives. When the smoke finally clears, Pepys returns to his office. The Navy Board has been spared, though the smell of charred timber lingers in the air. He inspects the ledgers, finding them mostly intact, and feels an almost sacred relief. The city may have burned, but the empire's memory, the records, the contracts, the ship accounts, survives. In his diary, he notes simply, "Blessed be God, our office is safe." The great fire marks a turning point. London will be rebuilt with stone, its streets widened and its houses regulated. Bureaucracy will expand to meet the new needs of rebuilding, new plans, new permits, new taxes. For men like Pepys, this means more work, more paper, and more power. He throws himself into it with zeal. The expanding empire. By the late 1660s, Pepys's duties have multiplied. The Second Anglo-Dutch War has begun, and the navy is again in chaos, underfunded, corrupt, and perpetually short of supplies. Pepys becomes the linchpin of organization. He drafts contracts for timber from the Baltic, hemp from Riga, and tar from Stockholm. He audits the pay of sailors, chases down fraudulent victuallers, and issues orders for the repair of warships. The details are endless, and to most, mind-numbingly dull. But to Pepys, they are the machinery of survival. He understands that war is not won by courage alone, but by logistics. the steady hum of procurement, payment and repair. He writes, "Our ships are brave and our men stout, but without victuals, pitch and rope, they are as helpless as children." As clerk, Pepys's power grows in proportion to his paperwork. He knows who owes what, where every nail and biscuit lies, and which captains have padded their expense reports. His knowledge becomes currency, his signature a key that unlocks the functioning of fleets. He is, in essence, one of the first civil servants of empire, a man who governs not through command but through record. The ordinary amid the extraordinary, even as war and fire consume the world around him, Pepys's diary continues to record the mundane. He frets over a new coat his wife's spending, a sore throat, he visits friends, eats oysters, watches plays, and buys a telescope. This mixture of the grand and the trivial, fire and furniture, kings and cheese, gives his writing its peculiar power. History, for Pepys, is not a series of great events but a steady flow of ordinary moments, each one noted before it fades. In this, his diary becomes something more than record, it becomes the rhythm of life itself. Every entry, whether about a ship or a supper, is an act of preservation. He is archiving the invisible, the texture of existence that history usually forgets. The clerk as chronicler, Pepys's role in government deepens. He begins corresponding directly with the Duke of York, later King James II, and is soon recognized as one of the most competent administrators in England. His efficiency and precision draw both admiration and envy, but the war goes poorly. In 1667, Dutch ships sail up the Medway and burn part of the English fleet. A humiliation for the crown. Pepys is blamed by some, praised by others. In his defense, he compiles massive reports detailing every ship, store, and expenditure. Each page is filled with figures, receipts, and annotations, a bureaucrat's shield against chaos. And through it all, he continues to write his diary at night. He notes, "To the office all the morning, mightily busy, and late home. I begin to think my eyes will fail me with so much reading and writing." The eyes and the mind, it is true. His eyesight begins to weaken. Years of poring over ledgers by candlelight take their toll. The pain frightens him, books and papers are his tools, and blindness would mean the end of his work. He consults physicians, tries various remedies, even experiments with avoiding reading altogether for a week. It is agony. His mind, restless without ink, turns inward. He begins to reflect on his own life, his ambition, his compromises, his sins. For a man so accustomed to recording the external world, the idea of losing sight is both literal and symbolic. He would become invisible to his own history. In May 1669, after 9 years of almost daily entries, Pepys decides to stop writing his diary. "For fear of losing my eyes," his final words are brief, practical, and quietly moving. "And so I betake myself to that course which is almost as much as to see myself go into my grave, for which, and all the discomforts that will accompany my being blind. The good God prepare me." He closes the book, perhaps not realizing that he has created one of the greatest records of daily life ever written. After the diary, Pepys does not vanish after 1669. He continues his career in the Navy Office, rising eventually to become Secretary to the Admiralty under King James VI. His reforms professionalized the Navy, establishing standardized pay, improved record keeping, and stricter inspection of ships. It is dull work, but revolutionary in its consequences. Through ledgers, Pepys lays the groundwork for the modern British civil service. He shows that empire depends not on heroism but on paperwork. His correspondence fills volumes, his reports are models of clarity. Even kings respect his diligence. And yet, despite his influence, Pepys remains something of an invisible man, a figure who shapes history from behind a desk. He never commands a ship, never fights a battle, never writes a law. He simply ensures that others can do so. London rebuilt by the 1670s, London has transformed. The streets are broader, the houses sturdier, the skyline marked by the rising dome of St. Paul's Cathedral, designed by Christopher Wren. Pepys watches the reconstruction with fascination, often visiting building sites to inspect progress. To him, it feels like watching his own life rebuilt. The fire that destroyed his city had also remade his purpose. He has lived through plague, war, and flame, yet always returned to his ledgers, as if order itself were his form of prayer. He notes in a later letter, "I do think that no man can say he hath seen more of this age than I've, both its miseries and its methods." The phrase, its methods, reveals much. Pepys's true loyalty is not to kings or causes, but to the method, to the system of record, balance, and order that defines his world. The invention of the modern clerk, it is easy, centuries later, to see Pepys merely as a diarist, but to his contemporaries he embodied something new, a type of man shaped by administration rather than aristocracy. The The clerk, the bureaucrat, the civil servant. His power did not lie in birth or sword, but in the mastery of information. He represented a new class of people who made the machinery of government work. Their tools were quills, not muskets, their battles fought on paper. It is this quiet transformation, this shift from personal rule to institutional management, that marks the dawn of the modern state. Pepys did not create it, but he chronicled it from within. A legacy in ink. After his death in 1703, Pepys's books and papers were sealed in a chest and stored at Magdalen College, Cambridge. For over a century, they remained untouched. When finally deciphered in the 19th century, his diary astonished readers with its intimacy and detail. Here was not the grand narrative of kings and wars, but the hum of daily life, the feel of the Restoration world in motion. Through Pepys, history became human again, full of noise, appetite, and ordinary effort. He never intended his diary to be read, and perhaps that is why it endures. It is not written for glory or legacy, but out of habit, the same habit that drove him to copy letters and check accounts. It is, in essence, bureaucracy turned into art. The man and his method imagined Pepys, years after the fire, seated in his office once more. The air smells of wax and parchment. His spectacles rest on the bridge of his nose. A new letter lies before him requiring his signature. He pauses, dips his quill, and signs. One more entry in an endless chain of order. Outside, London buzzes with trade, carriages, and construction. All the living proof that routine, discipline, and record can rebuild even a city reduced to ash. Pepys does not smile. He simply continues his work. The quill scratches, the wax cools, the ledger closes. Another day recorded, another piece of the invisible empire preserved. And as the candle burns low, you might wonder it is the winter of 1688, and London lies under a soft veil of frost. The air smells faintly of coal smoke, the streets quieter than usual. In a modest but comfortable home near Clapham, an aging Samuel Pepys sits by the window, wrapped in a woolen robe, his hands resting on the arms of his chair. The quill lies still now, his eyesight too weak for long hours of writing. But his mind, his relentless, organizing mind, remains sharp. Outside, the bells of St. Bride's toll faintly across the frozen city. The Restoration world he helped to order has changed beyond recognition. The monarchy trembles again. King James II, his old patron, faces rebellion. The glorious revolution is underway, and soon the Dutch Prince William will take the throne. Pepys, once at the center of the Navy Office, now finds himself caught in suspicion. His loyalty to the old king makes him, for a time, an object of distrust. He is briefly imprisoned in the Tower of London, a curious fate for a man whose power always lay in paperwork, not politics. But even there, in the cold stone cell, he keeps notes. He requests quill and paper. He writes letters of defense, citing records, receipts, and correspondence to prove his innocence. The clerk in him never dies, and perhaps that is what saves him. The sheer unshakable authority of documentation. The return to order after his release, Pepys retires from public life. He never again holds formal office, though his expertise remains respected. Admirals, ministers, and even the new monarch consult his writings for guidance on naval administration. He devotes his later years to organizing his collection, thousands of books, charts, and manuscripts, all meticulously catalogued. He arranges them not by subject, but by a system of personal logic, theology beside music, navigation beside poetry. Each shelf a reflection of his mind, a mind that sought harmony through order. Visitors to his house find him surrounded by these volumes, talking with enthusiasm about science, art, and ships. He is no longer a clerk of the Navy, but a curator of knowledge. Sometimes, in the quiet of evening, he runs his fingers along the spines of his books, feeling the smooth leather, remembering the weight of the world that once passed through his hands. Each ledger, each report, each diary entry was part of something larger, a vast machinery of memory. The invisible foundation. If the 17th century had its heroes, explorers, kings, soldiers, Pepys was not among them. And yet his work quietly sustained them all. It is easy to forget that ships of war and trade depended on the invisible infrastructure of men like him. Before a single cannon could fire, someone had to account for its powder, its crew, its repairs. Before sailors could be paid, someone had to sign their names in the books. Before a fleet could be sent to sea, someone had to calculate the cost, the stores, and the risk. Pepys understood this better than anyone. He had seen firsthand how disorder could cripple power, how corruption, unpaid wages, and misfiled reports could bring empires to their knees. In one of his surviving notes, he writes, "He that would rule the sea must first learn to rule the ledger." It sounds almost dull, but within that sentence lies the entire logic of the modern state. Order begins with information. Control begins with record. The death of habit. As Pepys grows older, his friends notice how his life has slowed into near-perfect routine. He rises late, breakfasts on tea and bread, reads or dictates letters to his clerk, and then walks in the garden. He enjoys conversation, particularly about ships, science, and music, and he spends long evenings playing the lute. But something within him feels unfinished. The diary he stopped 2 decades before still haunts him. He sometimes rereads fragments, dictating clarifications or corrections to his assistants. He treats the diary as another ledger, a document to be improved, polished, and finalized. He often says half-jokingly that the diary has a life of its own, that it keeps him company in old age. In April 1703, he suffers a final illness, likely kidney failure, a cruel echo of the ailment that had nearly killed him as a young man. He dies quietly in his home, surrounded by his books and a few loyal servants. There are no grand speeches, no last dictations, just a silence and the faint scratch of a clock marking time. He is buried beside his wife Elizabeth in St. Olave's church, the same church where he once dozed during long sermons, the same church whose bells he had heard during the Great Fire. The chest of memory after his death, his papers, meticulously organized of course, are sealed in a great wooden chest. Among them lie his official documents, his letters, and 6 thick volumes written in shorthand, the diary. For nearly a century they remain untouched. Scholars occasionally note their existence, but no one can read the shorthand. The chest becomes a curiosity, like a fossilized relic of a vanished bureaucracy. Then, in the early 19th century, a Cambridge student named John Smith deciphers the code. Slowly, painstakingly, he transcribes the diary into plain English. The result is astonishing. The world discovers not a dry record of administration, but a living portrait of Restoration London. Its pleasures, its pettiness, its pulse. Pepys, the man who thought himself ordinary, becomes a literary immortal. His name, once associated only with ledgers and naval memos, becomes synonymous with curiosity and candor. The diary reveals the birth of modern consciousness. A man observing himself as carefully as he observed his work. The poetry of administration. It is tempting to see Pepys's life as dull. A man bound to his desk, writing endless letters about biscuit stores and ship repairs. But there is, in his devotion to record, a strange kind of poetry. To write every day without audience or applause requires faith. Faith that order matters, that the smallest details have weight. His diary teaches that history is not made only of battles and treaties, but of habits, paperwork, and persistence. He was, in a sense, the poet laureate of bureaucracy, the chronicler of civilization's quiet heartbeat. And his legacy endures. The systems he helped build, the standardized naval accounts, the meticulous record-keeping, became the model for British administration across the world. The empire that would one day circle the globe was sustained not just by sailors and traders, but by clerks who kept their numbers straight. In their precision, one can still hear the echo of Pepys's quill. The modern resonance. Think for a moment of the world around you now. The files, the databases, the endless forms that define modern life. Behind every document, every official signature, lies a lineage that stretches back to men like Pepys. He lived at the dawn of that transformation. The moment when handwritten ledgers began to replace memory, when systems began to outlive their creators. Pepys sensed this, though he could not fully see where it would lead. In a late letter he mused, "Our papers will outlast us all, and perchance tell more truth of us than we would ourselves confess." That perhaps was his final insight. That paper remembers what people forget. The quiet legacy today. If you visit Magdalene College, Cambridge, you can still see his library, preserved almost exactly as he arranged it. The shelves are numbered, the catalogue is bound in leather, the air smells faintly of oak and dust. It is not a grand museum, but a private world frozen in order. Each book bears his small, neat signature, S. Pepys, Clericus. There, among volumes of astronomy, navigation and song, lies the evidence of a life devoted to understanding. Not through revelation, but through record. Standing in that quiet room, you can almost hear the faint scratching of his quill, the rustle of parchment, the ticking of a clock, the sound of bureaucracy made human. The man in miniature, and so we return to the image of Pepys at his desk. Younger now, the candle bright, the ink fresh. Outside, London stirs, a cart rolls by, a bell tolls in the distance, a ship's mast sways gently on the Thames. He dips his quill, opens his diary, and writes the date January 1st, 1660. He cannot know what the world will make of him centuries later. He cannot know that his private musings, his worries about money, his pride, his petty jealousies, will become one of history's most vivid portraits. He writes because he must, because writing is his way of existing, and through that act, small, repetitive, unglamorous, he secures a kind of immortality no king could command. For while monuments crumble and empires fade, the habit of record endures. The candle gutters. The ink dries, the final ledger closes, and as the last page turns, you might ask yourself, London, 1675. In a narrow workshop off Fleet Street, a man bends over a table strewn with gears no larger than fingernails. The smell of oil and brass fills the air. A candle burns low beside him, its light trembling on the curved surface of a half-built clock. This man is Thomas Tompion, the son of a Bedfordshire blacksmith, and soon to be known as the father of English clockmaking. His hands move with calm certainty, adjusting a spring here, a screw there, his eyes narrowed behind a magnifying lens. Outside, the bells of St. Paul's strike the hour, but inside this room, time is his to command. The century of measurement. To understand Tompion's world, we must first understand its obsession. The 17th century was the age when time itself became a problem to be solved. For thousands of years, people had lived by natural rhythms: sunrise and sunset, planting and harvest, prayer and rest. But by Tompion's day, England was turning into something new, a society of merchants, navigators, scientists, and clerks. Ships crossed oceans, astronomers mapped the heavens, kings demanded punctuality from their bureaucrats and armies. The world was becoming a web of schedules, and schedules required precision. Time had to be made mechanical. The patron and the craftsman, it was Robert Hooke, the restless genius of the Royal Society, who first drew Tompion into the orbit of science. Hooke, architect, physicist, and rival to Newton, had long sought to perfect the balance, spring a device that would make watches keep steady time no matter their motion. He found in Tompion the ideal craftsman, meticulous, inventive, and patient. Together they worked through the night, testing springs, adjusting escapements, noting each fractional improvement. Their workshop became a laboratory, part forge, part temple, and in 1675, after months of labor, they achieved a pocket watch accurate to within seconds per day. It was a small object, but it contained within it a revolution. The clocker's philosophy: to build a clock was to make a statement about the universe. For centuries, time had belonged to God, measured by the movements of the sun and stars, sung by monks at canonical hours. But a mechanical clock suggested something radical: that time could be measured by man, that nature's rhythms could be replicated and improved by gears. Each oscillation of a pendulum was a claim that the cosmos itself was mechanical, that precision could replace providence. The philosopher Thomas Hobbes had already imagined the state as a machine. Now, through the work of men like Tompion, the metaphor became literal. To govern people, you had to measure them. To measure them, you had to measure time. The Royal Observatory in 1676, Tompion's fame reached the highest circles. King Charles II commissioned him to build 2 great clocks for the new Royal Observatory at Greenwich, one for solar time, one for sidereal star time. The observatory itself was a kind of cathedral to precision, designed to solve the longitude problem, the great navigational puzzle of the age. If sailors could determine their east-west position at sea, they could navigate the globe safely. But that required clocks that kept time accurately for months, across rough seas and changing temperatures. Tompion's clocks became the heartbeat of the observatory. They ticked so steadily that astronomers could time the passage of stars to the second. And so, in a sense, the British Empire began not in conquest, but in calibration. The discipline of hours, but the revolution was not confined to observatories or workshops. Across England, clocks began appearing in town halls, churches, and eventually private homes. Time, once local and irregular, became uniform. Bells rang not just for prayer, but for work shifts, court sessions, and train schedules. Factories would come later, but the mentality was already forming. The idea that time could be divided, owned, and sold. The mechanical clock became the hidden engine of capitalism. Tompion's quiet workshop, with its gears and springs, was as revolutionary as any political pamphlet. The clockmaker's personality: those who knew Tompion described him as a man of reserved temper and mathematical patience. He spoke little, but when he did, it was often about proportion, the beauty of symmetry, the virtue of balance. He kept meticulous notes on every clock he built, assigning each a serial number. His apprentices joked that he treated his clocks like children, each one a unique experiment. In truth, they were more than that. They were his philosophy made visible, order embodied in brass. Tompion saw in timekeeping not merely craftsmanship, but morality. To make a clock that did not lie was, to him, an act of virtue. And in this, He shared the spirit of his age, the belief that the universe itself could be perfected by measurement. The shadow of perfection, yet the closer one approaches precision, the more elusive it becomes. Even Tompion's finest clocks drifted, losing seconds each day. His successors, George Graham, then John Harrison, would continue the pursuit, refining the pendulum, inventing temperature compensation, and eventually conquering the seas. But the deeper truth remained: no clock could ever be perfect, and perhaps that is why they fascinated men like Tompion. Because in their ticking they mirrored the human struggle itself, the attempt to impose order on a world that resists it. Time and power. By the early 18th century, England had become a nation synchronized. Its fleets sailed on timed tides, its merchants struck bargains by the hour, its courts and exchanges opened to the chime of bells. The state had learned what the clockmakers had long known, that to control time is to control people. From the punctuality of the navy to the discipline of the factory, the clock governed behavior as surely as any law, and the silent tick that began in Tompion's workshop would echo for centuries. In schools, offices, railways, and digital screens, the dream of order in his later years, Tompion often sat alone in his workshop long after midnight, listening to the chorus of ticking from dozens of finished clocks around him, each one a voice, precise and steady, marking the passage of his life. He sometimes said that time felt different when surrounded by clocks, less like a river, more like a landscape of intervals. When he died in 1713, he was buried in Westminster Abbey, a rare honor for a craftsman. On his tombstone, there are no poetic inscriptions, only a few quiet words: "Here lies Thomas Tompion, who made the clocks that measure the motion of the heavens." It is enough. The machine and the soul standing in the workshop of history. We might wonder what Tompion truly created. Not just clocks, but a culture, a way of thinking in which precision became synonymous with truth, and time itself became a tool of progress. In the centuries that followed, the same logic that drove his gears would drive the engines of factories, the pulses of telegraphs, the rhythms of computation. The dream of the clockmaker, a world that runs on perfect intervals, became the architecture of modernity. And yet within that dream, a paradox lingers, for in our obsession with measuring time, have we forgotten how to live in it? It begins with a ship, the HMS Centurion 1740. Her timbers creak against the grey swell of the Atlantic. On deck, sailors haul ropes, curse the cold, and glance uneasily at the sky. Below, in a small cabin lit by an oil lamp, a man bends over a box no larger than a loaf of bread. Inside it ticks a delicate machine, the most important in the world. The man is John Harrison, and the box is his marine chronometer. It is the latest heir to Thomas Tompion's dream, a clock so precise, so resistant to motion, that it might finally solve the greatest problem in navigation, the measurement of longitude. The problem of longitude, to understand the obsession that consumed Harrison and his age. Imagine sailing across an ocean before accurate timekeeping existed. Latitude was easy. You could find it by measuring the angle of the sun or the North Star. But longitude, your east-west position, was another matter entirely. To know where you were on the globe, you needed to know the exact time at your home port and compare it to the local time on your ship. If the sun reached its zenith an hour earlier than it did in London, you knew you were 15 degrees east. But a clock that lost even a few seconds a day could put you hundreds of miles off course. For centuries, sailors relied on dead reckoning and luck. Many did not return, ships vanished into fog, empires lost fortunes. The quest for longitude became the century's most urgent scientific riddle, and time itself its elusive key. The Board of Longitude in 1714. The British government created the Board of Longitude, offering a reward of 20,000, an enormous fortune, to anyone who could find a practical solution. The challenge united astronomers, mathematicians, and artisans. Some proposed lunar tables, vast charts showing the moon's position against the stars, to be compared by telescope and sextant. Others turned to the heavens for divine guidance. But John Harrison, a self-taught carpenter from Yorkshire, believed the answer lay not in the stars, but in gears. The carpenter's genius Harrison was a man obsessed by motion. As a boy, he built wooden clocks using parts scavenged from the countryside. Oak gears lubricated with sheep's fat, pendulums made from iron rods. He had never seen the sea, but he understood the language of precision. By his 30s, he was designing clocks that lost less than a second a month, an achievement unmatched by the finest workshops in London. When he learned of the Longitude Prize, he was convinced he could solve it. His idea was simple: create a clock so stable that it would keep time accurately aboard a rolling, pitching ship. But the sea was a cruel adversary. Salt air corroded metal, temperature warped springs, and motion destroyed the delicate balance of escapements. Still, Harrison began. He worked alone for 5 years on his first design, the H1, a massive brass machine weighing 75 pounds. It looked more like an astrolabe than a clock. A tangle of rods, balances, and circular gears. Yet when tested, it performed astonishingly well. The Board of Longitude, skeptical but intrigued, agreed to let him continue. The quest for stability over the next 20 years, Harrison built 4 versions of his marine timekeeper, each smaller, simpler, and more reliable than the last. He replaced pendulums with balance wheels, invented temperature compensating mechanisms, and even designed his own alloys to resist corrosion. By the time he produced H4 in 1759, the clock resembled a large pocket watch. Beautiful, compact, and astonishingly precise. When tested on a voyage to Jamaica in 1761, H4 lost just 5 seconds over 81 days. The Board of Longitude was stunned and suspicious. Surely, they said, no craftsman without formal training could have done this. They demanded further tests, endless inspections, and reports. Harrison grew old waiting for recognition, but the world had already changed. The moment of synchronization, with the arrival of the marine chronometer, the oceans themselves began to obey the clock. Ships could now determine their position anywhere on Earth, day or night, in storm or calm. The age of global navigation, and with it the age of empire, entered a new phase. The same precision that had ruled Tompion's workshop now ruled the waves. A voyage that might once have drifted aimlessly across the Atlantic could now be plotted with mathematical certainty. The world became measurable, predictable, and, in a sense, conquerable. Every ticking chronometer aboard every ship carried the heartbeat of Greenwich Mean Time, the invisible line from which the world would one day measure itself. Greenwich and the global clock. By the 19th century, Greenwich had become the center of the world's temporal map. British naval dominance ensured that its timekeeping system spread wherever its ships sailed. From Bombay to Barbados, colonial offices set their clocks by Greenwich, synchronizing the movements of fleets, railways, and telegrams. In 1884, at the International Meridian Conference in Washington, representatives from 25 nations voted to make Greenwich the prime meridian, the 0 point of longitude and the standard of world time. It was an act both scientific and imperial. The sun might rise first in the east, but the world now turned by the clock of London. Time as a tool of empire in the colonies, the imposition of British time was not merely practical, it was ideological. Railway schedules, military drills, and bureaucratic deadlines imposed a discipline that was as foreign as it was efficient. Local rhythms of prayer, of market, of monsoon were gradually replaced by the ticking of imported clocks. In Calcutta, officials complained that native clerks arrived late to work. In Kenya, the railway timetable became the symbol of colonial order. Time became a silent language of power. To control the minute was to control the man. The industrial clock at home, too, the empire of seconds reshaped daily life. Factories required workers to arrive and depart at fixed times. The whistle replaced the bell as the sound of discipline. Punctuality became a virtue, and lateness a moral failure. The poet Charles Lamb lamented that he could not escape the tyranny of the hour hand. The novelist Anthony Trollope famously wrote that he produced 250 words every quarter hour before going to his job at the post office. An act of literary clockwork. Even leisure began to run by the clock trains to seaside resorts, theatre curtains rising at 8, tea served precisely at 4. The mechanical heart of the 17th century had now become the pulse of civilization. The telegraph and the collapse of distance. Then came the telegraph, the electric nerve that connected continents. For the first time, messages could outrun the sun. But to coordinate global communication, every station had to operate on synchronized time. In 1847, the Great Western Railway adopted Greenwich time as its standard. Within a few years, telegraph lines carried time signals from London to cities across Britain, and then across the Atlantic. In 1880, the British government made Greenwich Mean Time the official legal standard for the nation. Time had been nationalised. A decade later, it became international. The birth of time zones, the spread of railways across America created chaos. Each town set its own local time, often differing by minutes from its neighbour. Trains ran on overlapping schedules, and collisions were frequent. In 1883, American railroads adopted standard time, dividing the continent into zones an hour apart. The following year, the idea was ratified internationally. What began as a craftsman's quest for accuracy had become a planetary system. Every clock, from a kitchen wall in Manchester to a telegraph station in Singapore, now beat in rhythm with Greenwich. It was not just the world that had shrunk, It was time itself. The philosophers of time by the late 19th century, thinkers began to notice the transformation. Karl Marx saw in factory time the rhythm of exploitation, labor sold by the hour, measured by the second. E.P. Thompson later described it as the birth of time discipline, the internalization of punctuality, obedience, and productivity. But for others, the clock was liberation, a means of order, predictability, and safety. Trains ran on time, ships reached port, factories prospered. The clock had conquered chaos. The empire's quiet legacy, even after the fall of empire, its seconds remain. The world still keeps time by Greenwich, though the empire it served has long since dissolved. Each smartphone, satellite, and computer still synchronizes to that same invisible pulse. A legacy of Tompion's gears, Harrison's chronometers, and the dream of perfect order. And yet, as our devices count milliseconds, one wonders whether the old clockmakers would recognize their creation in the fractured hum of the modern world. We measure more than ever, and yet understand less of what we measure. The final paradox: John Harrison, denied full payment of his reward until he was nearly 80, never saw how completely his invention changed humanity. But his clocks survive, their tick steady, their brass still gleaming, as if time itself were paying him back in patience. He had once written in his notes that the true measure of time was not in seconds or degrees, but in constancy. The clock, he said, should be as faithful as the heart that loves. Perhaps that was his real invention, the marriage of mechanism and devotion. And perhaps that is why, even now, as our world runs on atomic precision, we still trust the soft, rhythmic ticking of an old clock. A reminder that behind every empire of seconds, there was once a human pulse. There is a room in the Royal Observatory at Greenwich, high above the Thames, where the clocks never stop. Brass dials gleam in dim light. Pendulums swing in glass cases. Each second drops like a bead of mercury, measured, recorded, and transmitted. On the wall, a red ball rises to the top of a pole. At precisely 1 o'clock it falls. For more than a century, that daily signal marked the exact time for ships on the river below. Captains watched it fall, synchronized their chronometers, and sailed out to sea. But today, few look up. The ships are gone. The river is quiet. And in a small, windowless basement beneath the observatory, atomic clocks now keep time with a precision that Thomas Tompion, Robert Hooke, or John Harrison could never have imagined. They do not tick, they hum faintly invisibly, measuring the vibrations of cesium atoms, dividing the second into 9, 192, 60, 31, 770 parts. Time has become so precise that it no longer feels human. The industrial heartbeat, the 19th century, had been a triumph of mechanical time. Factories ran on whistles, railways on timetables, offices on hourly wages. To be modern was to be punctual. The factory clock became the overseer of life, dividing the day into neat segments of labor and rest. But with industrialization came fatigue. Workers rose before dawn, trudged to mills, and labored to the rhythm of machines. The historian E.P. Thompson once described it as the great synchronization, the moment when the natural flow of days was replaced by the artificial pulse of industry. To be late was to be punished. To waste time was to sin. Clocks hung above factory floors like unblinking eyes. The city of time by 1900, London was a symphony of clocks. Public buildings boasted turret clocks. Railway stations flashed digital seconds on telegraphs. Even the humblest pocket carried a timepiece. Time had become democratic, but also oppressive. In a single morning, one might hear the bells of St. Paul's, the striking of Big Ben, and the whistles of departing trains. Each announced authority in its own key. The city itself was a machine for measuring life, and beneath it all, in basements and workshops, thousands of men and women labored to keep the mechanism running: clock repairers, telegraph clerks, time signal operators. The empire of seconds required maintenance. Every tick depended on invisible hands. Einstein's heresy then, at the dawn of the 20th century. A young patent clerk in Bern, Albert Einstein, looked at the system of clocks and saw something strange. If two clocks, miles apart, were synchronized by telegraph, they could never truly agree, because the signals between them took time to travel. And so, he reasoned, time itself must depend on motion, on the observer. In one stroke, Einstein dissolved centuries of mechanical certainty. Time was no longer a river flowing steadily from past to future. It was a field, elastic and relative. The machine that had once tamed the heavens now seemed quaint, almost naive. The clockmaker's dream had become a physicist's paradox. The age of the wristwatch, and yet, as theory shattered the old order, the ordinary rhythm of life ticked on. During the First World War, soldiers strapped small watches to their wrists, a practical adaptation for coordinating attacks. After the war, the wristwatch became a universal symbol of modern manhood. Each carried his own clock, synchronized to the collective time of the nation. Factories mass-produced watches by the millions. Advertising promised that to own your time was to control your destiny. But the reality was the opposite. The more precisely we measured time, the less of it we seemed to have. Punctuality had become anxiety. Time becomes electric. In the 1920s and 30s, the next transformation began. Electric clocks replaced mechanical ones in schools, offices, and railway stations. A single master clock could now control hundreds of others through wires and impulses. The sound of ticking faded from daily life, replaced by the silent sweep of synchronous motors. Time no longer moved in steps, but in currents. At the same moment, the radio began broadcasting time signals to the world, the steady pips from Greenwich. Millions tuned in daily to synchronize their watches. The human race, scattered across continents, now lived by a single electronic heartbeat. War and the precision of death. In the Second World War, timekeeping became a weapon. Bombers relied on synchronized watches to strike targets. Radar operators timed pulses of radio waves to detect enemy planes. Submarines guided by chronometers lurked beneath oceans in deadly patience. The war ran on schedules, timetables, and countdowns. The line between the scientific and the mechanical, between the laboratory and the battlefield, disappeared. Each technological advance in timekeeping brought with it a refinement in destruction. And when the atomic bomb fell, it was detonated not at noon or midnight, but at exactly 8:15 a.m. Precision had become annihilation. The atomic second in 1955, at the National Physical Laboratory in Teddington, physicists Louis Essen and Jack Parry built the first cesium atomic clock. It was not elegant, a tangle of tubes and wires, but it measured time by the vibrations of atoms themselves. The pendulum had been replaced by the pulse of the universe. In 1967, the second was officially redefined in atomic terms. The clockmaker's dream was complete and obsolete. No craftsman's hand could improve upon it. But something else changed quietly, beneath the surface, the meaning of time. When the pendulum fell, we could imagine time as a human rhythm, a swing, a beat, a breath. Now, with the atom, time became abstract, precise beyond perception, detached from experience. We could measure it perfectly, but no longer feel it. Time without ticking in the digital age. The sound of time has vanished. Wristwatches blink silently. Phones synchronize automatically. The old rituals of winding, listening, and waiting have disappeared. The clock has retreated from the physical world into invisible code. We live now in network time protocols, in milliseconds, in GPS signals that bounce between satellites and servers. Our devices check the time billions of times per second, not so we may be punctual, but so the world itself may function. Planes landing, stock markets opening, computers talking. Time has become infrastructure. But like all infrastructure, we barely notice it until it fails. When a leap second misaligns, when a satellite clock drifts, the entire web of modern life shudders. The old clockmaker's care, oiling, balancing, listening, has been replaced by cold redundancy, by algorithms correcting themselves. And somewhere, in that transition, the poetry of time was lost. The return of the human clock. Yet, curiously, in the quiet corners of modern cities, people have begun to rediscover the comfort of slowness. Mechanical watches, once obsolete, are now luxury items, valued not for accuracy but for imperfection. To own one is to resist the tyranny of the atom. Artisans polish gears, adjust escapements, and listen again to the heartbeat of brass. A mechanical watch today can lose several seconds a day, yet it feels more alive than any atomic clock. It reminds its wearer that time is not merely to be measured, but lived through. The Museum of Time in Greenwich, the observatory's oldest rooms, are now a museum. Visitors walk past Tompion's great clocks, Harrison's shining chronometers, the telegraph transmitters of the Victorian age. Children press buttons to hear the tick of the past, and though the modern time signals above their heads are silent, there's something comforting in the sound of those old mechanisms. The slow, honest rhythm of a spring unwinding, of brass touching steel. It is the sound of time as people once knew it, imperfect, mechanical, and deeply human. The final reflection. Thomas Tompion dreamed of measuring the heavens. John Harrison dreamed of guiding ships safely home. Their successors dreamed of perfection, and achieved it, only to find that perfection was sterile. Today, we inhabit a world so precise that time itself feels digital, almost detached from life. Our seconds no longer flow like a river, but flash like pixels. And yet, beneath the hum of satellites and the whir of atomic clocks, the old rhythm endures. The pulse of the heart, the breath, the waiting. The true measure of time, perhaps, is not in seconds or vibrations, but in our awareness of passing. Each tick, however faint, reminds us that time is both machine and mystery. The clockmaker's dream did not die. It simply changed shape. From brass to quartz, from pendulum to particle, from workshop to universe. And somewhere, in that long chain of precision, humanity still listens for the faint echo of a clock that once tamed the heavens, and in doing so taught us how to measure ourselves. If you had lived in London in the summer of 1858, you would have known the smell before you saw the city. It began as a faint soreness, clinging to the air over the Thames. Then, as the days grew hotter, the river turned brown and sluggish. By mid-June, the stench was unbearable, thick, putrid, and inescapable. It seeped into homes, shops, and Parliament itself. Curtains were soaked in chloride of lime, windows were nailed shut. Queen Victoria cancelled a river cruise. Clerks fainted at their desks. And for the first time in living memory, the rulers of Britain, proud heirs of empire, masters of industry, were forced to confront the unromantic truth of their own civilization, that the capital of the modern world was drowning in its own waste. This was the Great Stink. The river as mirror for centuries. The Thames had been London's heart, its trade route, its drinking source, its mirror. But by the mid-19th century, that mirror reflected something foul. Every cesspit, drain, and privy in the city emptied into it. Slaughterhouses bled into it. Tanneries poured chemicals. The runoff from factories mingled with the filth of 10 million bodies. London's population had tripled in a century, and the infrastructure of medieval times could not contain it. Yet the river, in the eyes of the Victorians, remained an emblem of greatness, a symbol of commerce and destiny. They built bridges across it, embankments beside it, and mansions overlooking it. They believed, in that peculiar mid-century confidence, that progress would somehow purify what it defiled. But progress has a smell. The age of invisible death before the Great Stink, London had already suffered through decades of cholera epidemics. In 1832, the disease swept through the slums of Southwark and Whitechapel, killing thousands. Doctors were baffled. They blamed the asthma, a poisonous vapor, thought to rise from decay. To breathe the stench, they believed, was to invite death. Few imagined that the true killers were invisible creatures in the water itself. The idea that disease might spread through drinking contaminated water, the theory of contagion, was considered radical, almost heretical. One man, a physician named John Snow, suspected otherwise. Dr. Snow and the pump on Broad Street in the summer of 1854, another cholera outbreak struck Soho. Snow began to map each death, marking the addresses in ink upon a street plan. The pattern formed a grim constellation, a cluster around a single water pump on Broad Street. He proposed that the pump's well had been contaminated by sewage. His evidence was compelling, his reasoning clear. Yet most authorities dismissed him. They clung to the old belief that disease came from smell, from moral decay as much as physical. Still, Snow persisted. He convinced local officials to remove the pump handle. The outbreak subsided. It was one of the first victories for modern epidemiology, though few noticed at the time. Snow died 4 years later, before the Great Stink forced the world to listen. Parliament in purgatory by June 1858, the heat was unbearable. At Westminster, members of Parliament could not endure the odour drifting up from the river. Curtains were soaked in lime. Carbolic acid was poured onto the banks. Newspapers described ministers fleeing the chamber, handkerchiefs pressed to their faces. The Times called the Thames Stygian pool, reeking with ineffable and intolerable horror. The government, so often indifferent to the poor who lived beside the river, was finally compelled to act, not out of compassion, but self-preservation. The Great Stink succeeded where cholera had failed. The engineer from Westminster entered Joseph Bazalgette, a quiet, meticulous engineer, trained in the art of precision and patience. He had worked for years designing roads and bridges, but it was in the filth of London that he found his calling. In 1858, Parliament granted him the power to construct what would become the London main drainage system, the largest public works project the world had ever seen. Bazalgette's task was both monumental and mundane, to collect the city's waste and carry it far downstream, away from the people who produced it. He approached the problem with mathematical elegance. Beneath the city, he designed 82 miles of main sewers, supported by further 100 miles of smaller drains, brick tunnels wide enough for men to walk through, laid with perfect curvature for gravity to guide the flow. Each pipe was designed to be twice as large as needed, an act of foresight that would later save the city from disaster. Building the underworld construction began in 1859. Thousands of labourers dug through clay and gravel, often waist deep in muck. They worked by lamplight, breathing the damp air of the tunnels. Above them, Londoners continued their lives, drinking tea, riding omnibuses, and reading in the glow of gaslight, unaware of the vast subterranean arteries forming beneath their feet. Bricks were laid with obsessive care, 318 million in total, joined with mortar that hardened like stone. Great pumping stations rose at Chelsea, Deptford, and Crossness, vast cathedrals of industry decorated not with saints, but with ironwork and steam engines. Each was designed not merely to function, but to impress, a testament to the moral dignity of cleanliness. The Victorians, after all, believed that sanitation was not only a matter of health, but of virtue. The river transformed by 1865, the first sections were complete. Sewage that had once flowed openly into the Thames was now intercepted, carried eastward, and discharged far below the city. The stench lessened. Cholera outbreaks declined. When Queen Victoria returned to the river, she found it, if not beautiful, at least bearable. The transformation was not immediate nor complete, but London had begun to breathe again. The river that had been a symbol of decay became, once more, a symbol of progress. A nation redeemed by filth, Bazalgette became a national hero, though he rarely sought fame. He was knighted, and his sewers, unseen by most, were hailed as the foundation of modern public health. Visitors from across Europe came to study the London system. Paris, Hamburg, and New York soon followed. In an age of empire, even sanitation became an export. Engineers carried British sewage systems to colonies around the world, bringing with them the gospel of hygiene. The empire, it seemed, had learned to rule not just by conquest but by plumbing. The hidden legacy today, Bazalgette's sewers still carry London's waste, a hidden monument to an age that worshipped both progress and cleanliness. They run beneath the glass towers of the city, beneath theatres and railways, beneath the same parliament that once fled from the smell. Few who walk above know the scale of the world below. Even fewer imagine the men who built it. The navvies who dug the tunnels, the bricklayers who worked by candlelight, the engineers who mapped the veins of the city. The empire of mud remains invisible, yet indispensable. It is, in its way, the true foundation of the modern city. And yet, as the 19th century drew to a close, new questions arose. Was sanitation merely a matter of engineering, or was it a mirror of morality, of how a society defined purity and filth, order and decay? When the Victorians buried their waste, did they also bury something of themselves? Perhaps the empire of mud did not end at the riverbank, but extended into the unseen spaces of class, poverty, and conscience. When Joseph Bazalgette completed his labyrinth of sewers beneath London, the city breathed a sigh of relief, a literal one. The great stink was gone, the cholera receded, and Parliament congratulated itself on the triumph of engineering over nature. Yet beneath this relief was a deeper transformation. The story of the sewers was not only about pipes and pumps. It was about a shift in the moral imagination, the belief that cleanliness was not merely a condition, but a virtue. The Victorians came to see sanitation as the physical embodiment of progress, the sign that a society was righteous, orderly, and destined to rule. Thus began what one historian later called the moralization of hygiene, the gospel of sanitation. By the 1860s, a new language had entered public life. Words like drainage, filtration, and disinfection were spoken with the same reverence once reserved for faith. Public health boards printed leaflets like sermons. Cleanliness is next to godliness. The phrase was older than the Victorian age, but now it became literal. Churches organized cleanliness drives. Schools taught children to scrub their hands, their floors, their souls. Soap advertisements borrowed the rhetoric of salvation. To wash was to become virtuous. To be dirty was to be degraded. The city, once divided by wealth and class, was now divided by hygiene. The inspector's eye, new professions emerged to enforce this gospel. Sanitary inspectors, armed with ledgers, thermometers, and moral certainty, began to enter the homes of the poor. They measured dampness, noted odors, counted windows. Their reports described the slums in a tone that mixed pity with disgust. Rooms were foul, close, offensive. Tenants were ignorant of the simplest decencies. The poor, it seemed, had not merely failed economically, they had failed hygienically. And thus the language of sanitation became a tool of distinction. The wealthy were refined, the poor were unclean. The city's divisions deepened not by walls, but by smells. The sewers of empire, as London cleaned itself, it began to look outward. The same engineers and administrators who built sewers in Westminster were soon dispatched to Calcutta, Bombay, Singapore, and Cairo. They carried with them blueprints, bricks, and a conviction that British rule could be justified through cleanliness. The colonies, in their eyes, were not merely politically unruly. They were physically dirty, And so the empire's mission took on a sanitary form. Maps of drainage systems appeared beside maps of trade routes. Colonial governors spoke of draining the swamps of superstition. Missionaries taught the washing of bodies alongside the saving of souls. Cleanliness became civilization's perfume, and filth its proof of inferiority. The laboratory and the lavatory, the age of sanitation, was also the age of science. In the 1880s, the work of Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch revealed the true nature of disease. The invisible agents of infection were not miasmas or moral failings, but microbes, living organisms, too small to see, too numerous to imagine. This discovery vindicated Jon Snow's intuition, long dismissed in the age of smell. Yet, in a curious twist, germ theory did not dispel the moral overtones of hygiene, it intensified them. Now, dirt was not only unsightly, it was alive. Every smudge, every droplet, every shared glass became a potential invasion. The home itself became a battlefield, and cleanliness a form of defense. The cult of domestic purity in Victorian households, the idea of cleanliness took on almost religious significance. Soap was no longer just for washing, it was a symbol of status and salvation. Advertisements depicted glowing mothers holding spotless babies, saved from grime by Pear's soap. One campaign even portrayed the act of washing as a civilizing gift to the dusky races of empire. The domestic sphere became the moral engine of modern Britain. Women, especially, were tasked with maintaining this fragile purity, keeping the home clean, the children healthy, the husband respectable. To fail at hygiene was to fail at virtue. The forgotten workers, yet behind every gleaming bathroom and polished brass tap stood the unseen labor of thousands. The night soil men, who emptied cesspits before the sewers came. The scavengers who swept the streets at dawn. The washerwomen, who scarred clothes until their hands cracked from lye. Sanitation had its own class hierarchy. For every engineer who drew a blueprint, there were 100 workers who handled the city's filth directly. In the hierarchy of purity, someone always had to remain impure. The sanitary city. By the 1890s, London had become a model for the world, the first sanitary metropolis. The great pumping stations at Crossness and Abbey Mills were visited by dignitaries, journalists, even poets. They were cathedrals of machinery decorated in cast iron and tile. Each arch, each column, seemed to declare that cleanliness was not just necessary, it was beautiful. Public baths and washhouses multiplied. Parks were laid out to provide lungs for the city. Water companies expanded filtration systems. The Victorian ideal of progress now meant circulation of air, water, and waste, all managed by invisible hands. A clean city was a moral city, and morality could be engineered. The dark reflection, yet for all its triumphs, the age of sanitation had a shadow. The same logic that purified the city also justified control over the poor, the colonized, and the non-conforming. The metaphor of dirt became a weapon. Immigrants were described as unclean elements. Whole districts were labeled infested. Sanitation became a pretext for demolition, relocation, and discipline. Cleanliness, it turned out, was not a neutral value. It carried with it the authority to decide who belonged. The smell of memory. By the early 20th century, the Thames was cleaner than it had been in living memory. Cholera was gone, the sewers worked. Londoners had forgotten the great stink. And yet, something of that old smell lingered, not in the air but in the mind. The Victorians had built their city upon layers of concealment. Beneath every drawing room lay a drain. Beneath every sermon on purity lay a system of pipes that carried away the evidence of impurity. Modernity, in a sense, was defined by what it buried. The sewers had transformed London, but they had also taught it to hide. The engineer's burden, Bazalgette himself, retired quietly. He lived long enough to see the city he had saved flourish, and his design vindicated. When he died in 1891, his obituaries praised his genius, but not his philosophy. And yet, if one reads his letters, there is a note of melancholy. He knew that his achievement was both magnificent and invisible. "Let those who come after," he wrote, "see that the sewers of their day are well built." It was both an instruction and a warning. For Bazalgette understood something his contemporaries did not. That progress is not the elimination of filth, but its management. There is no such thing as a clean civilization, only one that hides its dirt well. The empire reflects in the colonies. The logic of cleanliness grew more intricate. In India, British sanitation officers drafted endless reports on drainage, plague prevention, and native habits. In Africa, model towns were built to separate European quarters from indigenous settlements. The sanitary line drawn as clearly as any wall. To clean was to rule, to drain was to dominate. The empire of mud had become global. Pipes and pumps stretched across continents. carrying not only water but ideology, the conviction that modernity could be built, brick by brick, flush by flush. A civilization of sewers. By the dawn of the 20th century, the sewers of London had become a metaphor for civilization itself, hidden, vast, indispensable, and faintly shameful. They represented everything the Victorians wanted to be: efficient, moral, and unseen. Yet, beneath the triumph of sanitation lay a quiet irony. The cleaner the city became, the more its citizens feared contamination. The germ was invisible, the world full of threat. Cleanliness, once liberation, had become obsession. And so, as the empire spread its pipes and pumps across the world, a question began to echo through the tunnels beneath London. If cleanliness was the measure of civilization, what would happen when the dirt finally ran out? When the last river was drained, the last slum demolished, the last impurity flushed away, would humanity feel purer, or merely emptier? The answer, perhaps, lay ahead, in a new century that would test the very limits of cleanliness, not only in body but in soul. The Thames, by the dawn of the 20th century, had changed beyond recognition. Where once it festered, it now gleamed in the morning sun. The air over Westminster was fresh again. The tides rolled past embankments lined with granite and iron railings. Tourists came to marvel at the beauty of the river that had once driven the government indoors. To them, London appeared eternal, civilized, a triumph of reason over nature. But beneath that calm surface the sewers still murmured. Miles of brick tunnels carried the waste of millions, unseen and unacknowledged. The triumph of sanitation was not merely the removal of filth but the concealment of it. That concealment, more than any steam engine or telegraph line, defined the modern world. The quiet city. Modern cities are designed to hide their workings. The pipes run beneath the pavements, the wires above the ceilings, the ducts behind the walls. We live surrounded by systems we rarely think about. Yet without them, life would collapse in hours. This invisibility began with Bazalgette. He imagined London not as a collection of streets, but as an organism: arteries, veins, lungs. The flow of water replaced the flow of waste, the circulation of air replaced the miasma. The ideal city, to the Victorian engineer, was one that ran silently, without odour, without overflow, without interruption. Cleanliness was not only a virtue now, it was efficiency. The machine under the skin. By the 1920s, the logic of sanitation had spread to every corner of urban life. Factories were built with tiled walls that could be hosed down. Hospitals gleamed in white enamel and glass. Even schools were designed with wide windows and smooth floors to allow for proper ventilation and hygienic inspection. The modern aesthetic, white walls, shining steel, the smell of disinfectant, was not born in art studios but in sewers, laboratories, and hospitals. The Bauhaus architects of Germany, inspired by industrial design, declared that ornament is crime. They built their structures like machines for living, pure, functional, and clean. Behind their vision lay an unspoken inheritance from Bazalgette, the belief that perfection begins with sanitation. The world below expands as cities grew. So did their hidden systems. New York built its own vast tunnels, Paris expanded its catacombs of drainage, and Tokyo laid pipes through earthquake zones. The logic of the sewer became global. By the mid-20th century, planners spoke of infrastructure with the same reverence the Victorians once reserved for morality. Every modern metropolis was a descendant of the Empire of Mud, its order born from the same desire to master what was once feared. Even the term clean energy carries the echo of that Victorian ideal: progress without impurity. But the dirt never truly disappears, it merely changes form. The psychology of purity, the Victorian passion for sanitation, seeped into the human mind. Psychologists began to notice a new kind of anxiety among the modern population, an unease with disorder, contamination, and imperfection. Freud called it anal morality, the association between cleanliness, control, and virtue, born in early childhood and reinforced by society. To flush, to polish, to tidy became acts of discipline. A clean desk, a swept floor, a deodorized room. These were no longer luxuries but necessities, symbols of self-mastery. In the 20th century, this psychology scaled upward, becoming civic. Governments launched Clean City campaigns, advertisements promised purity in a bottle. The public learned to equate beauty with sterility. We built entire economies on hygiene, from soap to antiseptic, from detergent to deodorant. And in each advertisement, the ghost of the great stink lingered, whispering, "You are only as good as you are clean." The war on germs in the early 1900s, scientists armed with microscopes declared a new kind of battle, no longer against miasma, but against the invisible legions of bacteria and viruses. Soap was joined by disinfectant, hot water by chemical warfare. Hospitals became laboratories of sterility. Doctors scrubbed, boiled, sterilized, gloved, masked. The white coat became a uniform of purity, its color, chosen not for beauty but for visibility of stains. To be clean was to be modern, scientific, rational. But there was a darker side. The obsession with hygiene, once directed at microbes, began to be applied to people. Political movements adopted the language of purity. Racial, cultural, national. Entire populations were labeled as contaminants. What began as an effort to cleanse the river had become, in the hands of ideologues, an attempt to cleanse humanity itself. The fragile ideal by the mid-20th century, London's sewers were showing their age. The system Bazalgette built, heroic, vast, and meticulously planned, was never meant for a population of 8 million. Pipes cracked, tunnels overflowed, new pumping stations were added, but the principle remained the same. Move the waste away, faster, farther, always invisible. Yet, as the city expanded, nature pushed back. Heavy rains flooded the old sewers, mixing stormwater with waste. The Thames grew foul again, not from neglect, but from success. From a city that had outgrown its own perfection. Engineers began to speak of sustainability, of ecological balance. A new kind of cleanliness emerged, one not of marble and brass, but of cycles and renewals. The age of purity gave way to the age of complexity. The return of the river in the late 20th century, London undertook another monumental project, the Thames Tideway Tunnel, a 25-kilometre super sewer, built to intercept, overflow and restore the river once more. It was Bazalgette's dream, updated for the digital age. Engineers used sonar satellites and simulation models to trace every drop. Yet the spirit was the same, the desire to tame the flow, to keep the surface calm. Modern Londoners stroll along the embankments, drinking coffee, watching the water glint beneath bridges. Few imagine the subterranean labyrinth that makes their leisure possible. Every flush, every rainfall, every bath is a conversation between the city and its unseen machine. The empire of mud never ended. It evolved. The philosophy of filth. It is strange, perhaps, that the greatest monuments of the Victorian age are invisible. No cathedral or palace matches the scale of Bazalgette's underworld. Yet invisibility is the very point. The sewers are monuments to denial, to the human desire to remove, to cleanse, to forget. They remind us that civilization, for all its polish, depends upon systems that deal with what we reject. Every society must choose where to place its dirt, whether in rivers, in prisons, in distant colonies, or in the hidden algorithms of the modern world. We are still building sewers, only now they are digital. We flush not waste but information. We bury not filth but data, and just as the Victorians once feared the river's smell, we now fear exposure, leakage, contamination of a different kind. The principle endures purity through concealment. The weight of water. If you could walk through the tunnels beneath London today, you would hear a sound like breathing. Pumps thrum, valves hiss. The air is thick and damp. You would see bricks laid more than a century and a half ago, each still in place, still bearing the weight of the city above. Somewhere, deep beneath the embankment, a plaque reads, "This work was inaugurated by His Royal Highness, the Prince of Wales, 1865. But the true dedication belongs to the millions who never saw it, who only smelled its absence." The empire reversed in our own age. The old moral equations have inverted. To be clean, we now realize, is not always to be good. Sterile fields yield fragile ecologies. Purified cities breed loneliness. The more we remove the dirt, the more we erase the texture of life itself. We begin to see value in what the Victorians fled from. The compost, the bacteria, the living mess that sustains the earth. In a strange twist of fate, the new vision of progress is not cleanliness, but reconnection. Where once we drained the swamps, we now restore wetlands. Where once we buried rivers, we now unearth them. Where once we feared contamination, we now seek balance. And perhaps, beneath the roar of the city, Bazalgette's tunnels hum in quiet agreement. Reflection. The story of London's sewers is not only about water and waste. It is the story of civilization learning to manage its own shadow. The Great Stink forced the modern world to face what it had long denied. That progress, unchecked, produces its own pollution. Joseph Bazalgette's genius lay not in bricks or drains, but in humility. He understood that the foundation of civilization is not its monuments above ground, but its willingness to handle the dirt below. To build a city, one must first accept what it leaves behind. And so, as you drift to sleep tonight, imagine the gentle flow beneath the city. Steady, constant, unheroic. It carries away what we no longer need, and in doing so allows life above to continue. The empire of mud endures not as filth, but as balance. A reminder that to be clean is not to be pure, but to be human. Before the machines came, before the chimneys rose, England was a quiet land. Its wealth lay not in factories or coal seams, but in the endless patchwork of fields, wheat, barley, oats, and pasture, all stitched together by hedges and stone walls. The year was measured by the soil: spring for ploughing, summer for growth, autumn for harvest, winter for rest. Every life was tied to the rhythm of these seasons. Every bell that rang in a village church marked not the hour of industry, but the hour of light. To live was to labour, and to labour was to wait, upon weather, upon soil, upon time. And then, quite suddenly, time itself began to change. The slow turning of the land. In the early 18th century, Britain was still, for the most part, a rural country. 4 out of 5 people lived off the land, and farming was a matter of inherited custom rather than invention. Each village worked the land in long strips, divided among families but farmed in common. Oxen pulled wooden ploughs, and men walked the furrows in silence, their rhythm as steady as the earth itself. Fields were left fallow every few years to recover, their soil replenished only by time and manure. There was no sense of urgency, the land moved slowly as it always had. But beneath that calm surface, something was stirring, a quiet revolution of numbers, enclosures, and machines. The age of calculation. The first sign of change came not in the field, but in the ledger. Landowners began to keep accounts, measuring yield, calculating rent, estimating efficiency. The language of farming shifted from tradition to productivity. In 1701, a man named Jethro Tull, a gentleman farmer with an obsession for precision, introduced a strange new device, the seed drill. It was a wooden contraption with a hopper and a set of rotating tubes, designed to drop seeds at measured intervals and depths. To his neighbours, it looked absurd, a clockwork toy for a man who thought too much. But it worked. Tull's machine increased yields and reduced waste. It turned farming from an art of habit into a science of repetition. He wrote about his ideas in a book called Horse, Hoeing Husbandry, filled with meticulous diagrams and theories about soil and air. He believed that farming should be mechanical, that nature itself could be improved by rhythm and order. For the first time, the English field began to tick like a clock. The enclosure of the commons, while Tull measured his furrows, Parliament measured the land. Through a long and quiet process, the ancient open fields of England were enclosed, divided by hedges, walls, and laws. The Enclosure Acts, passed over the course of the 18th and early 19th centuries, transformed millions of acres of shared farmland into private property. Where once villagers had grazed their sheep freely or gathered firewood in common, now fences rose. Land was consolidated, efficiency improved, and ownership concentrated. The new fields were geometric, rectangles and squares designed not for community, but for control. The landscape itself began to look mechanical. For many, it was a kind of progress. For others, it was exile. Dispossessed families drifted toward towns, carrying with them not tools but memories. The smell of soil after rain, the sound of the scythe at dawn. The agrarian revolution did not only change the land, it changed the people. The arithmetic of bread. By the late 18th century, Britain's farmers were producing more food than ever before. They spoke of improvement, a word that meant both efficiency and morality. A good farmer was no longer one who followed the old ways, but one who maximized yield. Crop rotation replaced fallow fields: turnips, barley, clover, wheat, each feeding the next. Livestock were bred for meat rather than endurance. The soil itself became a subject of study, its nutrients measured, its chemistry analyzed. The countryside became an experiment. At first, the results seemed miraculous. More food, fewer famines, higher rents, and richer landlords. But the system had a cost. As yields rose, so did prices. The poor, now stripped of land, became dependent on markets for their food. And when those markets failed, as they did during war or bad harvests, the consequences were devastating. The arithmetic of bread could starve as easily as it could feed. The iron harvest, the 19th century, brought iron to the field. Threshing machines, reaping machines, and steam-powered ploughs began to appear across England. They hissed and clattered, their pistons gleaming in the sun. To see one working was to glimpse the future, a field harvested by a machine rather than a dozen men. But not everyone admired them. In the winter of 1830, rural labourers in southern England rose in rebellion. They called themselves the followers of Captain Swing, a mythical leader whose letters demanded justice. They smashed the threshing machines and burned barns, crying that the iron men were stealing their livelihoods. The government responded with soldiers, arrests, and hangings. The machines remained. Progress, it seemed, had chosen its path. The rhythm of the scythe gave way to the hum of metal, the muscle of men to the strength of steam. The harvest, once a communal ritual, became an industrial process. The new calendar of labor before the agrarian revolution, the year was cyclical, tied to nature's tempo. After it, time became linear, a line stretching toward efficiency and profit. The farmer's clock no longer followed sunrise and sunset, but market prices, shipping schedules, and urban demand. The fields that once paused for winter now grew root crops to feed animals through the cold. The barns that once slept after harvest now rang with the noise of threshing engines. The old festivals, the harvest home, the Mayfair, faded into memory. In their place came account books, schedules, and quotas. The countryside had become an extension of the factory floor, and yet, beneath the noise of progress, there remained the whisper of the soil, a quiet resistance, patient and enduring. The science of the earth. By the mid-19th century, science had entered the soil itself. A German chemist named Justus von Liebig published Organic Chemistry in its application to agriculture and physiology in 1840. He argued that plants did not live on air and humours, but on minerals and elements. Nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. It was a revelation. Farming was no longer about the farmer's intuition, but about chemistry. Fertilizers were developed, factories built to produce them. The earth became a laboratory. Liebig's theories spread across Europe, inspiring a new kind of farmer, part scientist, part entrepreneur. But something was lost in translation. His call for balance, for the recycling of nutrients, was replaced by the promise of endless yield. The land was pushed harder and harder still. For a time it seemed invincible. The land and the clock. It is easy to think of the agrarian revolution as a purely technical change. Machines, enclosures, fertilizers. But at its core, it was about time itself. For millennia, humans had adapted to the rhythm of nature. Now, for the first time, nature was expected to adapt to the rhythm of humans. The soil became a machine, the seasons, a schedule. This shift, quiet, practical, and profoundly dull, was one of the most significant in human history. It laid the foundation for the Industrial Revolution, for capitalism, for the very idea of progress. But it also marked the beginning of our estrangement from the natural world. To farm efficiently was to measure everything: yield, rainfall, labor hours. To measure everything was to believe that everything could be controlled. It was, in its way, the birth of modern time. The silent fields. By the end of the 19th century, the English countryside had grown quiet again. But it was a different kind of quiet, the silence of efficiency. Steam ploughs left neat, endless rows where once men had sung as they worked. Villages shrank, markets grew. The land still produced, but fewer people were needed to tend it. The countryside had become a backdrop to the story of cities. Yet without it, the cities could not live. The soil remained patient as ever, turning harvest into sustenance, sustenance into survival. And beneath the ticking of clocks and the hum of engines, it kept its own time, slow, unchanging, eternal. The unanswered question. The agrarian revolution promised abundance through order, and in many ways it delivered, but each improvement carried a cost: social, environmental, spiritual. As the plough gave way to the tractor, and the seed drill to the satellite, one question lingers: can the earth, once turned into a machine, ever be made whole again? By the dawn of the 19th century, Britain was no longer a nation of farmers. It was a nation of merchants, traders, engineers, and yet, everything they built still depended on the soil. The coal that fired the engines came from the earth. The bread that fed the workers came from the fields. But the countryside that once defined the English way of life was changing beyond recognition. The new world was not measured in acres, but in output. The ploughshare had become a machine, the harvest a calculation. And from that quiet transformation of the land came a global system, one that would bind together continents through wheat, wool, and wages. The agrarian revolution did not end in the fields. It began there. The people without fields and enclosure, efficiency, and machinery had increased yields, but they had also decreased need. Where once 20 men worked a field, now 2 could manage the same ground with horses and iron tools. The displaced labourers drifted from villages toward the growing industrial towns. Manchester, Birmingham, Leeds, Glasgow. They carried with them not the rhythm of the seasons, but the rhythm of the machine. In the city, the harvest was no longer measured in sheaves but in shifts. Time was counted not in hours of sunlight, but in wages. The great irony of the agrarian revolution was that its success in feeding the population also created the very population that needed feeding. Britain's urban centres swelled, their hunger constant, and so the countryside turned outward, toward the sea. The grain roads of empire. By the mid-19th century, Britain could no longer feed itself. The population had doubled, then doubled again. Domestic fields, though productive, could not match the pace of industrial growth. The nation that had invented agricultural efficiency now imported its food from abroad. Ships began to cross the Atlantic, bringing grain from Canada, beef from Argentina, and wool from Australia. The empire, once built for trade in luxuries, sugar, tea, cotton, now turned to necessities. The ports of Liverpool and London became gateways of sustenance. Sacks of flour, barrels of salted meat, crates of fruit, all part of a new, invisible harvest. The soil of Britain fed the empire fed Britain. It was a cycle of dependence, intricate, stable, and quietly unsustainable. The hidden arithmetic of hunger to the politicians of the age, the system seemed perfect. Free trade ensured abundance. Science ensured productivity. Machines ensured efficiency. But the cost of this perfection was hidden in the margins. When Britain imported cheap grain from abroad, it undercut local farmers. Rural wages stagnated. Smallholders vanished. Entire villages fell silent, their stone cottages left to crumble under ivy and rain. The countryside became picturesque, not productive. The land was still beautiful, but it no longer belonged to the people who worked it. Hunger did not vanish, it merely changed address. The same empire that filled English plates often emptied others. In India, for instance, railways built to export grain also carried away local harvests during famine years. Ships laden with food left ports as villages starved behind them. The logic of efficiency, once confined to fields and farms, had become an ideology. It cared only for movement, for profit, for yield, for progress, not for people. The colonial farm across the empire, the British vision of agriculture took root, sometimes literally. Surveyors marked out neat squares of land in Australia and New Zealand. Engineers drained marshes in Egypt, planted tea in Ceylon, and measured rainfall in the Punjab. They spoke of improvement, of civilizing the soil. But these projects were not only about food, they were about control. To measure land was to claim it. To plough it was to own it. Agriculture in the imperial age became both weapon and justification. In Africa and Asia, traditional forms of cultivation, shifting fields, communal grazing, rotational fallows, were declared inefficient. Colonial officers redrew the landscape with straight lines and schedules, imposing the logic of the English countryside upon foreign earth. They brought with them ploughs, laws, and ledgers, the tools of a world that measured value in output. The result was often a kind of silence, a suppression of older rhythms beneath the ticking of imported time. The machinery of plenty while empires expanded. The machines of agriculture grew larger, stronger, and stranger. In 1858, Cyrus McCormick's mechanical reaper began to appear across Europe and North America. In the 1870s, steam traction engines began to pull gangplows across the heavy clays of East Anglia. By the turn of the century, early petrol tractors rumbled through the fields, their engines coughing smoke into the dawn. Each invention saved time and displaced labor. Each improvement increased yield and demanded more capital. The farmer, once a craftsman of the soil, became an investor, a manager, a caretaker of machines. His world was not built on weather anymore, but on debt, maintenance, and market prices. The land no longer sang, it hummed. The empire feeds itself. The global web of agriculture grew ever more intricate. Wheat from Canada, butter from New Zealand, mutton from Australia, sugar from the Caribbean, all converged on British tables. The empire became an organism, its arteries of trade pulsing with the flow of calories. Steamships shortened distances. Telegraphs transmitted prices instantly. Refrigeration turned perishables into commodities. The result was a world that felt smaller, safer, and infinitely connected. Until something disrupted the flow. War, drought, blockade, or rebellion could starve an island nation within weeks. And so the empire built stockpiles, railways, and naval convoys to protect its invisible harvest. The machinery of plenty required its own machinery of defense. The logic of food became the logic of empire itself: control the supply, control the world. The quiet consequences, the industrial and agrarian revolutions, are often told as separate stories, one of steam and iron, the other of soil and seed. But in truth, they were parts of the same engine. Factories needed workers, agriculture displaced them. Cities needed food, mechanized fields supplied it. The countryside produced bodies for the mills and mouths for the bread. The factory whistle replaced the village bell, but the discipline was the same: efficiency, repetition, obedience to time. And just as machines required fuel, the empire required grain. This quiet partnership between agriculture and industry shaped not only Britain, but the modern world. The price of progress. By the late 19th century, progress had become an unquestioned virtue. Each new machine, each new law, each new technique promised improvement, but the old rhythms, The patient wisdom of soil, the communal labor of villages, the balance between taking and giving, were gone. The soil itself began to show fatigue. Years of intensive farming depleted its minerals. Artificial fertilizers replaced natural cycles. What had once been a living relationship between man and earth had become a transaction. The harvest, now predictable and mechanized, lost its mystery.